How much do we really know about the people we share our beds with, my dears? The ones we've chosen to build entire lives round, to trust with our secrets, our children, our futures. I've learned that sometimes the person sleeping beside you in the dark is a complete stranger, wearing a familiar face. You know, I spent 40 years thinking I understood my husband, Robert. 40 years believing that our marriage was the kind other women envied, the kind you see in photographs at church socials, the kind they write about in those women's magazines. But what if everything you built your entire identity upon was constructed from lies? What if the very foundation of your existence was rotting from underneath, and you were too busy being content to notice the decay? Looking back now, at 82 years old, I realize that the universe sends us warnings, little signs, whispers in the form of lipstick stains and late-night phone calls. But we women, we're taught to be patient, to be blind, to make excuses for the men we love. And that, my dears, was my greatest mistake. My name is Margaret Ellen Hartley. I'm 82 years old now. This story happened in 1987, when I was just 52 years old and thought I had my entire life figured out. Before I continue, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. I read every single comment, and your support means the world to me. We lived in Millbrook, Pennsylvania, a town so small that everyone knew your business before you did yourself. Population 4,200. The kind of place where the same families had lived for 3 generations, where Mrs. Henderson's lemon meringue pie was served at every church potluck, and where my husband Robert was the deputy mayor. Robert. Even now, saying his name brings up a tangle of emotions I'm not entirely sure I've untangled. We had been married for 23 years in 1987. 3 beautiful children. David, who was 14 and already thinking about college. Sarah, who was 11 and had her father's smile. And little Tommy, who was only 8 and still believed his daddy hung the moon. We lived in a butter yellow house on Elm Street with white shutters. I planted roses every spring, red ones. They won the Town Beautification Award 3 years running. Robert worked at the Millbrook Town Hall. He wore suits to work, always pressed perfectly. I pressed them myself with the sunbeam iron my mother gave me as a wedding gift. He came home at 5:47 p.m. Most evenings I knew the schedule, like I knew the rhythm of my own heartbeat. We'd have dinner at 6, pot roast on Sundays, chicken on Wednesdays, meatloaf on Fridays. He'd kiss me on the top of my head after dinner while I cleared the dishes. Good meal, Margaret, he'd say. That was our language of love. I was the president of the Ladies' Auxiliary at First Presbyterian Church. I baked for fundraisers. I coordinated the spring flowers for the altar. I volunteered at the library 2 mornings a week. Everyone knew Mrs. Robert Hartley, not Margaret. Mrs. Robert Hartley. That's who I was, and I wore that identity like a crown. We were happy, or so I believed, or so I needed to believe. They started small, my dears, so small that I almost missed them entirely. In the spring of 1987, I noticed Robert coming home smelling different. Not bad, you understand, just different, like something floral and expensive. I asked him about it once. I stopped by the funeral home, he said. You know how those places smell. I accepted this explanation because it made sense, because I wanted it to make sense. Then there were the new rules in our house. Robert decided suddenly, without discussion, that he would do his own laundry. I don't want to burden you, he said. This touched my heart. How thoughtful. But what 30-year-old man suddenly decides to do his own laundry after 2 decades of having his wife manage it? I didn't ask these questions. Women of my generation didn't ask such questions. He started staying late at town meetings. The Peterson Development Project, he'd explain. We're discussing the new shopping center. I'd have his dinner ready anyway, and he'd eat it cold, not bothering to warm it up. Sometimes he wouldn't come home until after I'd gone to bed. I'd lie there in the dark, listening for his car in the driveway. Money disappeared from our joint account. Not all at once, that would have been noticeable, but little withdrawals here and there. $200 on a Tuesday, $150 on a Thursday. I asked about it once. Business expenses, he said, and somehow I believed him, or the first pretended to. There's a thin line between the two. Little things went missing from around the house. My good pearls, the ones my grandmother gave me. I found them weeks later in Robert's desk drawer, but when I asked him about it, he said he must have moved them while looking for something, as if that made any sense. The worst part, my dears, was the way he began looking at me, with a distance in his eyes, like he was watching me from behind glass. When I'd come into a room, he'd look up and then quickly back down, as if I'd caught him doing something he shouldn't. My intuition screamed at me, that little voice inside, that women have that truth-telling voice we learn to silence. It was screaming so loudly I could barely think, but I silenced it, because acknowledging it meant acknowledging that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong with my life. It was October 18th, 1987. I remember the exact date because it was the day my entire world split into the before and the after. I found a lipstick stain on his collar, not just any lipstick stain, my dears. This one was a deep burgundy color, the kind of shade I would never wear. I wore pink, soft, pale pink, like a good woman should. This shade was bold dangerous, sexual. I was sorting his laundry, yes. I'd continued doing it despite his claims that he'd take over. Some habits are so ingrained in us that we can't break them even when we should when I noticed it. A perfect crescent moon of color on the inside of his white dress shirt collar. The kind of mark a woman leaves when she buries her face in a man's neck and holds on like she's drowning. My hands went numb. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed next to Robert's sleeping form, and I looked at his face in the darkness. "Who are you?" I wanted to ask, but instead, I got up and went to his office, the very office where he'd kept my grandmother's pearls. I found them there, tickets, train tickets to Philadelphia, 2 tickets, dated 3 weeks earlier. His name, and another name I recognized immediately, Father Michael O'Donnell from the rectory. Not an affair, my dears, not a simple, explainable betrayal, a secret life with the town's most revered priest. But that wasn't all. No, the universe, once it starts opening up a box of lies, doesn't stop until everything spills out. In the bottom drawer, under some folders, I found bank statements from an account I didn't know existed. $47,000 had been moved there over the past 18 months. Our savings, our children's college fund, gone. And attached to the statements was a letter from First Federal Bank regarding a personal loan in Robert's name, $35,000 borrowed against property we didn't own, with signatures I didn't recognize. I found credit card statements for a MasterCard I'd never seen, charges at a hotel in Philadelphia, a boutique called Josephine's on Rittenhouse Square, dinners at restaurants with romantic names like Lucille and the Palm. But the absolute worst discovery was in a showbox at the back of the closet. Photographs. Robert, dressed in my clothes, my best dresses, my silk slips, my heels. In some photos, he was wearing makeup. In others, he had a wig on, and in every single photograph, Father Michael was beside him, his arm around what I realized was my husband in drag, kissing him on the cheek or on the lips. My legs gave out. I sat down hard on the bedroom floor and began to shake. The front door opened downstairs. "Margaret, I'm home," Robert called out, cheerful, normal, as if his entire double life wasn't about to detonate. I didn't respond. I couldn't. I confronted him that night. I remember standing in the kitchen, the bank statements trembling in my hands, and I said, "Robert, who is he?" His face, I'll never forget his face. It went pale, then red, then something else entirely, something I'd never seen before. "His name is Michael," he finally said quietly, "and I love him." "For how long?" My voice sounded like it was coming from someone else's body. "How long have you been lying to me?" "Since before we were married," Robert said. And then he told me a truth that reframed our entire 23-year marriage. He had never loved me. He had married me because he was afraid. Because in 1964, Millbrook, Pennsylvania, being a homosexual man was a death sentence socially, spiritually, economically. He married me to hide. I was his beard, my dears. My entire marriage was a costume he wore. What about the children? I whispered. I love them, he said. That's real. You're a liar, I said. And I meant it with every fiber of my being. Within 2 weeks, Robert left. He packed a suitcase and moved to Philadelphia. Father Michael left the priesthood, and they rented an apartment together on South Street. The scandal was immediate and absolute. The town turned on me overnight. Not on Robert, he was gone, so they couldn't feast on him. They turned on me. The whispers were vicious. Did you know? Mrs. Dorothy Chen, the mayor's wife, asked me at the grocery store, her voice dripping with false concern that masked pure schadenfreude. A husband, and you didn't even know. The other women in the produce section heard her. They all heard. Poor Margaret, they said, which was worse than anything else they could have said. Pity. That's what I became. The pitied woman. The foolish woman who hadn't noticed her husband was living a lie. My job at the library ended the following month. Budget cuts, the director said apologetically. But we both knew the truth. The parents didn't want me around their children. Damaged goods. I was tainted by association with scandal. Robert stopped paying support. The $35,000 loan that he'd taken out in his name that became my responsibility. The credit cards were in joint names, so I inherited the debt. Within 6 months, I had less than $400 in the bank and 3 children to feed. David stopped going to school. He started working at the hardware store instead. 14 years old, and his childhood ended. Sarah became silent, withdrawn. Little Tommy asked me over and over, when is Daddy coming home? And I couldn't answer him. I couldn't tell him that his father had never really been home at all. I sold the roses. I sold the house. We moved into a small 3-bedroom rental on the other side of town. The kind of place where the carpet was thin and the walls were thin, and every noise from the neighbors' lives seeped into ours. You know what saved me during those years? Worky physical, exhausting, back-breaking work. I started by washing clothes for people. I'd go to their homes. With my supplies, my hands would scrub their delicate things, their silk blouses, their undergarments. My fingers cracked and bled. The arthritis started early, in my 50s, because of the caustic soaps and the hot water and the constant ringing. But I made money, $5 per household per week, and by 1988, I had 7 regular clients. My hands became withered and rough. The skin around my nails would turn red and raw. Sometimes I'd look down at these hands that used to arrange flowers for the church altar, and I wouldn't recognize them as my own. They were the hands of someone's servant, and in a way, that was fitting, because that's what I'd become. Then I started baking. Mrs. Catherine Walsh, my neighbor, the only person who continued to speak to me after everything fell apart, suggested it. "You make good cakes, Margaret," she said one afternoon, sitting at my small kitchen table with a cup of coffee. "What if you made them to sell?" So I did. I'd wake at 4:30 a.m. and start mixing batter. Pound cakes, chocolate cakes, angel food cakes, lemon meringue pies. I'd bake 6 days a week, and Mrs. Walsh would help me deliver them to the local diner and the grocery store. By 1989, I was making $300 a week from baking. It wasn't much, but it was something. It kept us fed. It kept the lights on. The physical toll was enormous, my dears. I'd stand at the stove for 8 hours at a stretch. My back would scream. My legs would swell up so that I couldn't fit into my shoes by evening. I'd lie in bed at night and cry silent tears because the pain was so intense I couldn't sleep. My son David would hear me and come sit by my bed, and he'd rub my feet without saying anything. And I'd feel my heart break all over again because he was 15 years old and should have been thinking about football and girls, not his mother's suffering. I started tutoring children in reading in 1990. I charged $10 per hour, and I'd do it in the evenings after my baking was done. I was exhausted, but exhaustion became my normal state. I learned to function on 4 hours of sleep. I learned to push through pain. I learned that the human body is capable of far more than we believe it to be. I also cleaned houses. Early mornings, before my baking started, I'd go to 4 or 5 homes and clean bathrooms and vacuum carpets and dust shelves. My knees became permanently damaged from kneeling on tile and wood. I was 30 kilograms lighter than I'd been 5 years earlier. My hair turned completely gray by 1991. I was 56 years old and looked 70, but slowly, so slowly, that I almost didn't notice it. Things began to improve. In 1991, I rented a small commercial kitchen from the Methodist Church. It was cheaper than trying to operate out of my home, and it allowed me to scale up my baking operation. I hired Tommy's best friend's mother, a woman named Rosa, to help me. Together, we could produce 40 cakes per week instead of 20. By 1992, Margaret's homemade confections was supplying desserts to 3 diners, 2 restaurants, and the county hospital's gift shop. I was making $1,200 a week. Not wealthy, but no longer drowning. The debt was still there, my dears. That debt followed me like a shadow for years, but it was manageable now. I was paying it down, month by month, and more importantly, I was beginning to feel something other than despair for the first time in 5 years. My hands were still rough. They probably always would be, but they were strong hands now. Capable hands. Hands that had held my family together while everything else was falling apart. It happened in the spring of 1993 at the Millbrook Spring Festival. I had been invited to set up a booth to sell my baked goods. The town council, different people now had reached out to me specifically. My business had grown beyond Millbrook. I was selling to restaurants in 3 neighboring counties. I had hired 2 full-time employees and was running a legitimate business. But I was still nervous about the festival. I wasn't sure how I'd be received after everything. I set up my booth early, arranging my cakes and pies on white linen tablecloths. I'd made special boxes with a logo, a drawing of roses to package my goods. Around noon, Mrs. Dorothy Chen approached my booth. The same woman who had humiliated me in the grocery store 6 years earlier. My stomach clenched. "Margaret," she said, and I braced myself for cruelty. "I want to order a wedding cake. My nephew is getting married in June." I stared at her. "Mrs. Chen, you're the best baker in the county now," she continued, as if I hadn't spoken. "Everyone knows it. I'd be lucky to have you make our cake." Before I could respond, someone else spoke up. "Margaret makes the finest cakes I've ever tasted," a voice said. I turned to see Mrs. Edna Kirkwood, the town's oldest resident at 92 years old. She was a force of nature, a woman who had buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children, and was respected by everyone in Millbrook. I'd never spoken to her before. "Not really. Your business is a credit to this town," Mrs. Kirkwood continued, looking directly at Mrs. Chen. "This woman worked harder than anyone I've ever known. She survived what would have broken most people. And some of us," she glanced around pointedly at the gathered crowd, "we made it harder than it needed to be." Mrs. Kirkwood bought 3 cakes that day. But more importantly, she gave me something that money couldn't buy: validation, respect, a public acknowledgement that I had earned my place in this community through my own effort and perseverance. Things shifted after that. By 1998, Margaret's Homemade Confections was operating out of a commercial kitchen in Harrisburg. I employed 12 people. I was supplying desserts to 14 restaurants and 3 grocery store chains. More importantly, my children were thriving. David graduated from Penn State in 1995 with a degree in engineering. Sarah became a teacher, just as she dreamed. Tommy went to college at the University of Pittsburgh and is now a lawyer. 3 beautiful, accomplished people who survived the worst of circumstances and came out strong on the other side. I have 5 grandchildren now. They call me Grandma Margaret, and they have no idea what their grandmother went through. They know me as the woman who bakes the best cakes, who tells the best stories, who gives the best hugs. That's who I want to be to them. The business grew, and eventually, I sold it in 2001 to a woman named Patricia who had worked for me for 7 years. I was 66 years old, and I was ready to rest. The sale gave me enough money to retire comfortably, to buy a small house in Lancaster, to finally sleep through the night without worrying about money. As for Robert, I heard through mutual acquaintances that he and Father Michael, who was never Father Michael again, after he left the priesthood, lived together in Philadelphia for many years. Robert died in 2003 of a heart attack. He was 78 years old. Michael called me after he passed. He spoke about you. Michael told me, especially as he got older. He said you were stronger than anyone he ever knew. I didn't know what to do with that information, so I didn't do anything with it. I received the Millbrook Businesswoman of the Year award in 2000. My photograph was in the local newspaper, and they did a feature story about my rise from tragedy to success. I cried reading it, not because of the glory or the recognition, but because I saw myself in the newspaper article as someone worthy of respect. Looking back now, at 82 years old, I understand so much more than I did at 52. That lipstick stain on his collar, it was a gift, my dears. I didn't know it at the time, but it was. It took away my false life and gave me permission to build a true one based on my own strength, not on a man's approval or a husband's name. The pain, and there was so much pain, physical and emotional. That pain became my teacher. It taught me that I could survive anything, that my worth wasn't tied to my marriage or my social standing in a small town, that my hands could create beauty and abundance even when my heart was breaking. You know what's funny? The life I built after Robert left me was infinitely more satisfying than the life I lived with him. The roses I grow now are only for myself, and they're more beautiful for it. To anyone watching this who feels like their world is falling apart, I want to say, you are so much stronger than you think you are. The worst things that happen to us often become the best things in the end. The betrayals, the losses, the moments when you think you can't possibly survive one more day, those are the moments that are forging you into who you're meant to become. Don't be ashamed of your scars. Wear them proudly. They are evidence of your survival. Thank you for listening to me today. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. Share with someone who might be needing a little hope. Where are you watching from? Leave it in the comments.